Today I am speaking to possibly the world's best negotiator.
And for more on this now, we're going to bring in our next guest, Chris Voss.
Christopher Voss.
Retired FBI special agent, hostage negotiator, and terrorism expert.
He's a former lead international kidnapping negotiator for the FBI.
In his incredible career, he's gone from negotiating with terrorists to negotiating in business. And today he shares the worst negotiation mistakes he's made. But first, he was quick to point out that hostage negotiations aren't similar to how we see them in the movies. No, real-life negotiations aren't dependent on ultimatums, bargaining, and power play. They are based on softer psychology.
Human beings make their decisions pretty much the same. How does this affect my identity? How does this affect my vision of the future? My autonomy? Do I have control over my own decisions? How much do I have to lose?
But what are the negotiation tactics that fail? What well-known advice doesn't perform in the real world? Well, Chris had an immediate answer for me: getting angry.
Yeah, well, there are things that don't work short term. Some stuff works really well short term, and then it's really bad long term. Like, there's a tactic out there called strategic umbrage. Do you demonstrate anger in order to get your way? And there's even a study that says it works. And what it does is it might help you get your way temporarily, momentarily, and then it's just really bad long term. The other side just hates it. It's toxic. They're going to spend time paying you back. And, I have my doubts as to how well it is effective short term anyway, because the study that says it's effective was based on simulated negotiations. When I went through Harvard Law School's negotiation course, we did a lot of simulated negotiations, and people love to practice simulated negotiations. But they're fake in that you're playing a role, you're the CEO of a cosmetics company, or you're selling your iPhone. First of all, it's a role that it's not you, so you're not going to react authentically, emotionally. And then even more important, when students are given a simulated negotiation, in reality, they sit down for one conversation. They talk from 45 minutes to an hour. And the only way that they feel like they failed is if they don't make a deal. And then there's no ongoing relationship. It's a one-off, it's a fake one-off, and it only lasts for an hour. So students get together and they talk for about 45 minutes and they haven't gotten to a deal. And one student goes like, this is really bad. They start faking anger, and so they'll come to the deal because their only failure was not getting a deal. Well, in real life, no negotiation happens in one setting in 45 minutes. And no negotiation is that you never see the other person ever again and never cross paths with them. One of my students at Georgetown thought he was in a one-off negotiation when he was buying cabinets at Home Depot, and used the bargaining method that's in my book, the Ackerman method, and just got a great price on cabinets. I mean, just pounded the salesperson, because I'm going to buy these cabinets. It's a one-off. I can afford to cut this guy's throat. Well, 2 weeks later, he comes back to the Home Depot because he's got an issue with his cabinets. Who does he run into? The guy he slaughtered in the negotiation. Were they willing to help him in any way, shape, or form on fixing a problem with the cabinets without just killing him over what they were going to charge him? No, they had all this pent-up anger over getting pushed around. So that's one of the reasons why this study on strategic umbrage is just so wrong. Don't use anger to get your way, because even if you get your way short term, you are going to pay for it long term.
Not only does strategic umbrage, aka getting angry, harm you in the long term, Chris reckons it's ineffective in the short term. Sure, it might work in a fake negotiation, but in the real world, shouting at someone will probably backfire. One of my favourite studies, which loyal listeners of Nudge will know, showcases this nicely. In the study, researchers Nicholas Gagan and Alexandra Pascal asked commuters waiting at a bus stop for some spare change to take the bus. To start, they simply asked for money as normal, and they weren't too successful. Only 10% of commuters offered any change. But then they switched their negotiation tactic. They didn't get angry, they didn't shout. No, they did the opposite. They were kinder. For their new tactic, they added one line to their request. They simply said, "You are free to refuse me." Adding that one line had a huge effect. Now, the number of commuters who donated shot up to almost 48%. That's almost a 5-time improvement from the control. Movies, they make it seem like anger can help us in negotiations, but studies show that the opposite is true. Next up, I asked Chris about another popular strategy, pushing for yes. See, many salespeople will tell you that to win in negotiations, you just have to get your customer saying yes. Rather than asking, will you buy this car, a salesperson should say, you're a family man, right? To which they'll hear yes. And then they'll say, so you care about safety. You wouldn't want your family getting hurt, so I imagine you want to pay a bit more for the extra safety rating. We've all experienced this tactic, but Chris says that pushing for yes perhaps isn't as effective as sales gurus would have you believe.
You know, I happen to live in Las Vegas, but I've always used a Las Vegas analogy. Nothing works all the time. What you want is something that works more than anything else. And if you're a yes-oriented negotiator, you're winning maybe 10 to 15% of the time. Now you get out of that and your win rate is going to climb up well above 50%. So this yes-oriented stuff is leaving money on the table. Now, you read about the yes momentum selling. It calls each yes a micro agreement. Also refers to each yes as a tie down. And you get a series of micro agreements. And then they got to say yes to the big thing. You know, you got them tied down. Well, the first guy to really sort of attack this whole idea, Jim Camp, who was a friend and a colleague, in 2002 wrote this book called Start With No. And I remember walking through the airport, you know, I'm working kidnappings, but I'm reading every book on negotiation I can lay my hands on. And so I'm browsing a bookstore, and in a corner of my eye, I see this book says Start With No. And I'm like, what? And what? Start with no? I thought we were supposed to get yes. I thought it was getting to yes. And I double take and I go over and I grab the book and I start leafing through it. And I find 2 ideas in there. And I'm like, all right, so I got an idea. There's got to be more. I'm going to buy this baby and take it home. And Camp discovered that just telling people it was okay to say no increased his win rate. He was a yes-oriented guy. And I think people get started on this yes momentum because you're a salesperson. You're not selling anything. You know, your win rate is 1% maybe. But you know, you're not making any deals. You don't know what's going on. Somebody introduces you to the yes momentum, and suddenly you go from being an F student or a D student to being a C student. Now, your perception is there's been a great big leap in my success. I mean, I'm making deals. You know, a C student is passing classes. In, you know, American universities, if you're a D student, they kick you out. If you're a C student, you get to stay. And if you go from being a D student to a C student, you think you're ridiculously successful. You're surviving. You're making a living. And then you walk around going like, I make deals, getting yes. You know, it's a C student saying, I passed my classes. I'm going to get a college degree, saying yes. Relatively speaking, you don't know what it looks like to be an A student, even a B student. And so you, based on your personal history, you're very successful. So what happens with the yes momentum? Well, everybody gets bamboozled somewhere along the line. And it's my contention, my company's contention, and we haven't seen anything to contradict it yet, that the world is yes battered. Something as simple as, have you got a few minutes to talk? Every keynote I give, I'll stand up in front of 500 people and I'll say, all right, so the voice on the other end of the phone says, have you got a few minutes to talk? What's your reaction? And everybody in the room either gives me dead silence, which is an indicator of discomfort, or a bunch of people yell out, no, no. Something as simple as, have you got a few minutes to talk? And my question to everybody that listens to that, well, so if it's so great to say yes, if yes is the objective, then why, when somebody asks you, don't you shout out, yes, because it feels good to say yes? Well, it feels good to hear it, but to say it causes unease. So we're kicking around this start with no idea, which is just, Camp used to tell people when he would sit down to sell them something, it's okay to say no. You can say no to me at any time and I'll go away. And he started making more deals, and he called it preserving their right to veto or their autonomy. And when I read that as a hostage negotiator, I'm like, wow, that's exactly what's going on in hostage negotiation. As soon as we preserve their autonomy, it's a basic human need, they're more likely to listen to us and talk to us. And so we're kicking this idea around, and eventually we go, what happens if you intentionally get somebody to say no? How does that affect things? And I had a student at Georgetown did a paper where he was a salesperson and they had a no-oriented script and a yes-oriented script. You know, would you like to do this? Would you like to do that? Do you like this? Do you want to buy? 3 yeses, which is the yes momentum, and then a big ask. They ran the no-oriented script side by side at a sales location with the yes script, and the no-oriented script had a 23% higher success rate. Just switching the questions from yes to no. And it's always been my contention that if you can just switch from yes to no, instantly, you're 23% more effective. Instantly. You go from, that's the only thing you learn. You go from being a C student to a B student automatically.
For those listening carefully, you'll see some similarities between Chris's advice and the "you are free to refuse" study. Chris, like the researchers, found that preserving someone's right to say no helps in a negotiation. Now you might be thinking, well, Phil, this is just one study, it's just one person's view, how can we trust it? Well, there is evidence. The "but you are free to refuse" study has been tested not just once, but 42 times. And in 2013, Christopher Carpenter conducted a meta-analysis of all 42 studies on the effect, and his finding was conclusive. Across dozens of different disciplines and examples, adding "but you are free" doubles the chances that someone will agree to your request. The 2x improvement occurs with all types of requests, like asking for charity donations to help landmine victims, asking pedestrians to answer a survey, and even asking youngsters to volunteer at an old people's home. Saying "you are free to refuse" doubled success rate. But the meta-analysis did find that this principle works best in a face-to-face setting. Saying "you are free to refuse" online does also work, but not as well. Pushing for yes and strategic umbrage are 2 negotiation tactics that don't work. Now, in 1953, Colin Cherry conducted an experiment inspired by his experience at a cocktail party. See, Colin discovered something strange at these parties. He'd be deep in conversation, totally unaware of the noise happening around him. He wasn't aware of the dozen conversations happening in the room, the faint hum of music coming from the live band, the sound of glasses tapping and cutlery clanging. And yet, when someone said his name, Colin, in a conversation halfway across the room, he heard it. His brain ignored 99% of the other noise, but somehow became aware when his name was called. Dozens of follow-up studies have proved that this wasn't a one-off. The effect has been replicated. Colin called it the cocktail party effect. Since then, sales gurus have spoken about the power of a first name, how using a customer's first name can persuade them to buy. They've taken the cocktail party effect and assume it works for negotiations as well as it works for recognition. But Chris Voss isn't so sure. He thinks first names aren't as persuasive as we think.
Like a person's first name is precious to them. You know, there's a few things out there. Maybe consider it like you would a seasoning. You know, if you like salt on whatever your dish is, then you get a double, triple the amount of salt you put on it. No, you're going to be disgusted by it. It's going to be overdone. It's very off-putting. So a person's first name is very important to them. And what I like is I'll give my first name. And when they're comfortable, they'll tell me theirs. You know, I'm constantly reading, you know, the gathering data with your eyes, listening with your eyes to get somebody to the point where they're comfortable giving me their name. And it's like any social interaction, and which is kind of crazy why salespeople, when they're calling, especially cold call, you know, they'll start using a person's first name or even ask if it's there. But if you're in a social occasion, you're a business networking event, or you're networking in general, let's say they're name tags. The really effective people walk up and give their name first, just their first name. They say, "Hey, I'm Chris," and stop and wait, and let the other side then choose whether or not they're going to engage. And it's very much this autonomy issue. And you let the other person at their give their precious commodity their first name when they're comfortable. But in the meantime, you've instantly become a person. You've changed in front of their eyes, and it's a triggering reciprocity right off the bat and getting them to bond with you, so that when they give you their name, then you could use it. You're going to want to use it a couple times to remember it, but you're not going to want to batter them with it, because as soon as you start battering them with it, you become that used car salesperson that's just trying to hustle them, straight transaction, hustle them out of their dollar. And there's no shortage of people that are battering others with their name. And so you're creating a feeling of unease, and you're starting to drive them away by overusing the name. You want to use it once they've given it voluntarily, not when you pried it out, because they feel vulnerable when they give you their name, and they need to feel comfortable with that.
First names capture awareness. There's no doubting that. Referring to someone with their first name will capture their attention more than not using it. But that doesn't make it more persuasive. And Chris feels it's overused. By bombarding a customer with their first name, it starts to feel transactional. Now, many of the examples are hypothetical, but I wondered whether Chris had a failure to share from his own career.
There's plenty of failures. I mean, nobody, hostage negotiators got about a 93% win rate, which means if you work enough cases, something's going to go bad. And you just got to accept that. That's the definition of best chance of success, is the acceptance that you can't make every deal. When we're coaching people, what we really like to tell people on a regular basis is it's not a sin to not get the deal. It's a sin to take a long time to not get the deal. But before we even get into that, there's one other bad habit that I'd like to get into, and it's like high anchoring, extreme anchoring. A lot of data out there, and academic data that says name price first, and use it as an anchor to set the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. One of my Harvard brothers and sisters' acronyms, favorite phrases.
Now, this is interesting. On Nudge, I've regularly told you that high anchoring is effective. I've shared studies showing that beer sales increase if the menu starts with a high anchor, that auction bids increase with anchoring, and that also leading with a high anchor works in negotiations. But Chris thinks that I might be wrong.
And that's a tough one to get over, because what you'll see in real life, the majority, not all, but the majority of really successful business people will say, he or she who names price first loses. Well, how can you simultaneously high anchor and not name price first? And you dig into the really successful people, in my view, the Warren Buffetts of the world, the Oprah Winfreys of the world, and you find that the other side's price is data that you need. And what you have to be prepared for is, how do you react to the high anchor? The Mike Tyson line, everybody's got to play until they get punched in the face. One of my students wrote in one of their papers, an extreme anchor can make a vision disappear right before your eyes. What does that mean? They got anchored high, and they didn't expect to get punched in the nose, and their vision of how things were going to work out just sort of crumbled. So it's a preparation issue, emotionally reacting to an extreme anchor as opposed to looking at it as information. So for the longest time, I'm complete believer in not high anchoring. Gut instinct is that it drives deals from the table that you should otherwise make. My first piece of data on that is, every time somebody high anchors on me, I'm like, screw you. You grab them with both hands. I have no intention of dealing with you, because you're always going to grab with both hands, which means you're always going to be a bad partner. And I'm in LA at the time, and I run across a guy who's a friend of mine now, Ned Colletti's manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And when he was manager, they went from worst to first, his first year. Just because you're the manager of a professional sports team doesn't mean you're any good at negotiation. Lots of those guys as managers, their teams don't win. It ain't just the coach and the players, it's who assembled the players and who assembled the contracts to start with. in Ned's first year, without really changing, having a chance to draft people, they go from worst to first. Maybe this guy's doing something right. So I read his book, and just brilliant negotiator, low-key guy, loves to listen. And so we're sitting down at dinner one night, and I go, here's my opinion on anchoring. It's also what I think is in your book, but I just want to hear you say it out loud. I think high anchoring drives deals from the table that you should have made otherwise. And he goes, absolutely. And he starts telling me about in professional sports, when an agent comes in with a ridiculous ask on behalf of the player, the team just moves on. They don't even entertain the conversation. And they let the guy go out and either sign a worse contract with somebody else or sign a ridiculous contract with somebody else. And then one thing that Ned did on a regular basis, when he traded for players who had ridiculously high salary contracts, he'd make the other team eat part of the salary and not even pay it. That's one of my sample size behind my own experience on high anchoring is I don't do it because I hate driving a deal from the table that I should have made. And when somebody does it to me, I see him as greedy and I stop dealing with him. And then I talk to a guy like Ned, and his experience coincides with mine. So high anchoring is a bad idea.
When Chris experiences a high anchor in a negotiation, he immediately feels his autonomy is being threatened. He knows his partner is out to get him, and in response, Chris hardens up rather than working on a deal. Now, I'm still a firm believer that anchoring works. I've seen it boost sales, increase tips, and improve donations. But if you're negotiating and you use a ridiculous anchor, it can backfire. Asking your boss for a 200% pay rise won't help you anchor down to 20%. It'll make you seem unhinged. Telling a client that their yearly contract is doubling in price won't improve your position. It'll cause them to churn immediately. Chris says that a negotiation is between two partners, and if one feels their autonomy is constricted, they'll back out. To me, this is the theme behind all four of the mistakes we've shared today. Autonomy. We don't like it when someone gets angry. We don't like it when someone pushes for yes. We don't like overused first names, and we don't like high anchors. Why? Because all four of these tactics limit our autonomy.